Hello. Once again, devotional time. Uh, Blessings to you, wherever you are in the world today. And thanks for joining me. We're just going to continue our devotional. We're just trying to do this every day. Proverbs chapter 1, just going verse by verse. And today we're going to look at Proverbs chapter 1, verse 29. As we get close to the end of chapter 1, we come to an interesting verse today that connects back to the early part of the chapter. And so we're just going to take a look at that and see what we can glean from it. The method is, of course, just to read the verse, go through a few questions, give you a little bit of thoughts for your own devotional life, and see how they might be useful to you. But here we go. So in Proverbs chapter 1, verse 29. Oh, I'm getting feedback. Let's just shut that down for a moment. Sorry about that. Little feedback there. I don't know if you guys were getting that here or not, but we're certainly getting it here. Anyways, it's gone. Hopefully that didn't sound too loud for you. Proverbs chapter 1, verse 29 says, because they hated knowledge and did not choose the fear of the Lord. Now, this statement is part of a bigger statement. So we're going to look at this piece of it, but it's wisdom talking about people who didn't follow wisdom. They didn't choose wisdom. They rejected it. They rejected her teaching, rejected her reproof. And so then she's going down through this list, and she's saying, as part of her condemning of the rejection of wisdom, they get to this part, they say, well, because they hated, those that rejected it, because they hated knowledge, they did not choose the fear of the Lord. And then it goes on to give some more explanation about the outcome. But that statement is actually a kind of a reference back to earlier in the chapter, where it said, I think it was verse 7, where it said, the fear of the Lord is the beginning of knowledge, right? So there's this statement here. Now it says here, because they hated knowledge and they did not choose the fear of the Lord. So you see this connection. And the idea is to, once again, and you're going to find this through the book of Proverbs, there's a few places where it makes this reference back to that idea. It's a foundational idea in biblical wisdom, is that that the fear of the Lord and the increase. They say that hated knowledge. Well, that's part of their way of understanding wisdom and using the words of Hebrew at the time. But the idea of you will know because you fear the Lord, right? You'll become a knower of wisdom because you fear the Lord. And so here it's saying, well, they didn't want to know, and they chose not to fear the Lord, right? And so it's just this kind of a nod back to that really important part of wisdom. And so I want to go through our 4 questions today, and I want to take it from a little different angle than we did when we did verse 7. And here's the question. So if the fear of the Lord is the beginning of wisdom or knowledge, some may ask, well, what about atheists that seem wise? Like, there's a lot of very clever atheists in the world. There's a lot of scientists that are atheists, and they seem pretty smart and so on. And so there's a couple of things to say on that. One is that being smart about something is not what wisdom is about. That's not what we're talking about when we talk about wisdom. There's an aspect there, obviously, but that's not entirely what we're talking about. A person can be really, really knowledgeable on a subject without being a wise person, and so it's a little bit of a different thing. And that's not what we're speaking about when we talk about this biblical wisdom from Proverbs. But another angle of that is this: with regard to wisdom, there may be some very wise people who don't believe in God, sure. But the statement about this is not that there can be no wisdom in a person's life without the fear of God. It's not that. The fact that God is in the world and has created us in his image means that humans are built with the ability to grow in wisdom. And there's a certain amount of wisdom that we can grow in. The Bible uses this phrase in other places, the wisdom of men, meaning there is a wisdom that humans have. But we're talking about the foundations of wisdom. Even that wisdom is founded on the fact that God invested in humanity, his image, some aspects of himself, if you will. And that becomes a foundational aspect of why humans were the species on the earth that can dominate the earth, unlike any other species, for instance. So there's just a slightly different angle there. It's a bit more of an anomaly that a person who rejects God would find themselves in the area of wisdom. It's the more of the anomaly rather than the rule when we're talking about this kind of wisdom. Excuse me. Think about it this way: if a person rejects the idea of a higher power than themselves, right, a God, then there's going to be a tendency to become increasingly self-worshiping, right? Increasingly arrogant, we might say. There's going to be a tendency to move to thinking of yourself as the higher power. And that automatically will lead us to a place of wisdom, because we will cease to allow input, we will cease to allow income. And so there's an aspect there of when we don't fear God, we don't see, okay, there's this higher, greater power, this greater person, greater being, then we're going to tend to start to go inward, and that will slowly remove wisdom from our life. Even the wisdom of humans will slowly be lost. We can put the statement in a negative form, right? Not fearing the Lord is not the beginning of wisdom. And that's kind of the idea here, is you cannot build wisdom with a decision to not fear God. That is not a foundation of wisdom. Now, you may not fear God and still glean wisdom here and there, but you will not be able to build wisdom on that choice. And here the proverb is saying, they hated knowledge, they chose to not fear God, right? They did not choose to fear him, they chose otherwise. So that's kind of the idea there. Question 2, can a person have wisdom without the fear of the Lord? Well, certainly there's some level of wisdom. So like we said, it's not the foundation of wisdom to reject God, but there is a man-based wisdom in the world, and there are things that humans have been able to figure out. There's a verse in the Bible that talks about how man's wisdom fails, and later on in the Proverbs we'll come to that, how it eventually fails, even if in the meantime there's sort of like a sense that can be there, but in time it proves to fail. The statement about the fear of the Lord being the beginning of wisdom uses this word beginning. And the idea is not like you can't have any wisdom without it. It's more like the idea of the trajectory, the beginning of a journey. A person who fears the Lord sets themselves in a direction, says, I'm going to walk in this direction, and this is going to become foundational to my life, the fear of God. There is a God. But if we start a journey on any other foundation, we are not going to be able to get to that final place of real wisdom. We may be on a similar side road, maybe, but we're not going to get there. And we will eventually find that the journey fails to arrive at wisdom. So that's the idea. Question 3, why does God require fear of him for wisdom? I've encountered people who thought this as well. It's like, why would there be this stop measure if God is like this? Why can't we have wisdom without fearing him? And I would say that this is not actually a requirement. It's not that the Bible is saying you must meet this this criteria first, or else you're not going to be allowed to have wisdom. It's not quite like that. Although there is this area where it talks about if you lack wisdom, you can ask the Lord; He'll give you wisdom. So there's an inherent sense of respect there. But it's more of a statement of a fact rather than a requirement. It's not that God requires you to fear him to have wisdom. It's that you just simply can't get there without it. Wisdom that comes from God can't occur if you're not in relationship with God. Wisdom that comes from men can exist from men, sure, but the wisdom that God has, that biblical wisdom, can't come from God if you're not in relationship with him. So it's not really saying that you have to do this as a requirement. It's just that it's a fact, right? That's where you need to go. 1 Corinthians. So in the New Testament of the Bible, 1 Corinthians chapter 1, verse 21 says, the wisdom of the world, which means the world has a wisdom, the wisdom of the world is foolishness before God. So you put the two together, you say there's a wisdom of the world, which is a wisdom of sorts, and there is the wisdom of God. And the wisdom of the world compared to the wisdom of God is foolishness. So there's an interesting comparison there. If we fear God, we get to have the wisdom of God. If we do not fear God, we're left with only the wisdom of the world. And so that verse in 1 Corinthians 1:21 ends with saying how God catches the wise in their craftiness. It's like they think they're so clever, but then they encounter moments in their life where they come up against God's wisdom and they're caught up, and you can't stand, because the wisdom of God is superior to the wisdom of humanity. It's like this. Here's another little example to help understand it. If you think about physics, right, is mathematics, is that the beginning of physics, right? You might say in a sense, mathematics is the beginning of physics. Can you understand physics without mathematics? Yes, you can. There's lots of physics you can understand without having to know mathematics, but You're never really going to get it without having some math. You're going to need some math, or you're just not going to fully get physics. There's so much of physics is wrapped up in math. So you kind of need math, but you don't. I mean, you can kind of understand friction without knowing the numbers, but it sure makes a difference when you know the numbers, right? It's how they work together. It's kind of like that. The fear of God is the beginning of wisdom, and without it, you can have the world's wisdom. You're just never going to get that godly wisdom. You won't get there. Final question, question 4. How closely connected are wisdom and the fear of God? So how intimately connected they are, and that's the right word for it. They're intimately connected. Wisdom is not simply knowing the prudent thing to do. That would be the world's level. They would think, well, wisdom is simply knowing how to handle a situation. Okay. And that is part of wisdom. But wisdom is not just knowing the prudent thing to do. Wisdom is also knowing the good thing to do. And that requires moral judgment. And that moral judgment based on anything other than God is not moral judgment. It's desire. It's maybe it's democracy. It's, you can think of these kinds of things. It's those things, but it's not actual morality, because morality is based on the character of the good God, the only good being, the being that defines what goodness is, righteousness is. And so, as I've been saying through this whole chapter, wisdom is not merely knowing what to do to be prudent, but knowing what is the good thing. It's moral. Wisdom is a moral thing as well. You can't have proper moral judgment without a God, without the God. Morality based on anything other than God is not truly morality, and it will fail. And ultimately, we will actually end up in a very immoral or very unwise place. And so that's why the statement, he hated knowledge and did not choose the fear of God, means you cannot get to that biblical, godly, perfect wisdom unless you choose to fear God, no matter how clever you are. And so that's the point. That's what point Proverbs is making here. And if you reread the whole chapter in one sitting, you're going to find that's actually kind of the point of the whole chapter. And and so that's something for you to think about here today. I mentioned the other day about the change in tense. I'm going to answer that in a future video, but just to remind you of it, notice the change in tense or a person, right? If you, and then we got the last verse yesterday, and it says they. Think about that, and in a few videos from now, I'm going to talk about that and why it changed tense and like that, or changed focus on that from you to they. Oh, something for you to work with there today. God bless you in your own studies. Just going to challenge you in your life. Are you basing your wisdom merely on what's prudent, or are you also basing your wisdom on what's moral and what's good? In other words, are you basing it on the wisdom of men or the wisdom that comes from God? So God bless us all. Help us to be wise in your eyes the way you are. I pray in Jesus' name. Amen. God bless. God willing, I'll see you on Tuesday for the next video. Have a great day.